The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Just 4 words that would shatter everything. Don't come on Saturday. Sarah stared at her phone screen in disbelief, reading those words over and over until they burned into her retinas. Her sister Jessica had just uninvited her from the baby shower she'd been planning for months, the celebration she'd spent weeks preparing for, the moment she'd been dreaming about since Jessica announced her pregnancy. But what happened next would leave an entire family speechless and prove that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most beautiful victories. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez had always lived in her sister's shadow, a reality she'd accepted so completely that questioning it never crossed her mind. Jessica was 3 years older, 3 inches taller, and according to their mother, 3 times more successful in every way that mattered. While Jessica had married her college sweetheart straight after graduation and moved into a pristine suburban home with a white picket fence, Sarah had struggled through a series of failed relationships and dead-end jobs that left her feeling like she was perpetually running in place. The comparison game had started early in their childhood. Jessica was the golden child who brought home straight A's, while Sarah fought for B's and C's. Jessica was the star athlete who made varsity soccer, while Sarah warmed the bench on JV. Jessica was homecoming queen, while Sarah worked in the background organizing decorations that no one would remember. Even now, at 32, Sarah could still hear her mother's voice echoing through their childhood home. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" When Jessica announced her pregnancy 8 months ago, Sarah had felt a complicated mix of emotions surge through her chest. Joy for her sister's happiness, certainly, but also a familiar sting of inadequacy. Here was Jessica achieving another milestone that Sarah had dreamed of but hadn't reached. Sarah had been trying to conceive with her husband Michael for 2 years, enduring monthly disappointments that felt like small deaths, medical appointments that offered more questions than answers, and well-meaning friends who kept insisting she just needed to relax and it would happen naturally. Despite the private pain, Sarah had thrown herself into being the perfect aunt-to-be. She'd spent hours researching the best baby products, comparing strollers and car seats with the dedication of a professional consultant. She'd knitted tiny blankets during her lunch breaks, learning from YouTube videos because her mother had never taught her domestic skills, always too busy praising Jessica's natural talents in that area. Sarah had volunteered to help plan the baby shower before Jessica had even mentioned wanting one, eager to contribute something meaningful to this new chapter in their family's story. The planning process had consumed Sarah's evenings and weekends for the past 2 months. She'd created elaborate Pinterest boards, researched venues that would photograph beautifully, and compiled guest lists that included every important woman in Jessica's life. She'd spent her own money on decorations, ordered custom favors, and even arranged for a professional photographer because she knew Jessica would want every moment documented. The theme was Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, chosen because Jessica had mentioned loving that lullaby, and Sarah had spent countless hours cutting out paper stars and stringing fairy lights until her fingers were sore. What Sarah didn't know was that her sister had been having conversations about her behind closed doors, conversations that would have devastated her if she'd overheard them. Jessica had been complaining to their mother about Sarah's over-involvement in the shower planning, claiming that Sarah was trying to make it about herself instead of the baby. She'd whispered to their mutual friends that Sarah was probably just jealous and using the shower as a way to live vicariously through someone else's pregnancy. These conversations had been building for weeks, creating a narrative about Sarah's motives that painted her generosity as selfishness and her love as manipulation. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine planning meeting at Jessica's house. Sarah had arrived with fabric samples for table runners and a folder full of carefully researched catering options, excited to share her ideas and get Jessica's input on the final details. But instead of the collaborative conversation she'd expected, Sarah walked into an ambush. Jessica was there, along with their mother Patricia and Jessica's best friend Melissa, all wearing expressions that made Sarah's stomach drop before anyone said a word. "We need to talk," Jessica had said, her voice carrying that particular tone of superiority that Sarah remembered from childhood arguments. They were sitting in Jessica's perfectly decorated living room, with its neutral color palette and carefully arranged family photos that somehow managed to include very few pictures of Sarah. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows should have created a warm atmosphere, but instead it felt harsh and exposing. Patricia spoke first, her words carefully measured, but devastating in their cruelty. "Sarah, honey, we're concerned that you're getting too wrapped up in this baby shower. It's supposed to be about Jessica and the baby, not about you playing party planner." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow, leaving her speechless and struggling to understand how her efforts to help had been twisted into something selfish. Melissa chimed in with the kind of fake sweetness that barely concealed its venom. "We just think maybe you're projecting your own issues with having babies onto Jessica's celebration. It's not healthy for you, and it's not fair to Jessica." The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable designed to cut deeper than the last. Sarah felt her face flush with humiliation as she realized these women had been discussing her private struggles, turning her pain into gossip and her vulnerabilities into weapons. Jessica delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "I think it would be better if you stepped back from the planning. Maybe you could just come as a guest instead of trying to run everything." The dismissal was casual, delivered with the same tone Jessica might use to decline a dinner invitation, as if she hadn't just obliterated weeks of Sarah's hard work and genuine love. Sarah tried to defend herself, her voice shaking with hurt and confusion. "I was just trying to help. I thought you wanted me involved. I've been working on this for months because I love you and I'm excited about the baby." But her explanations fell on deaf ears. The three women had clearly already decided on their narrative, and Sarah's actual motivations were irrelevant to the story they'd chosen to believe. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, each exchange making Sarah feel smaller and more unwelcome. They questioned her decisions about the venue, criticized her choice of decorations as too childish, and suggested that her enthusiasm was really just a way of dealing with her own reproductive failures. By the time Sarah left that house, she felt like she'd been emotionally eviscerated by the people who were supposed to love her most. That night, Sarah cried herself to sleep while Michael held her, his own anger barely contained as she recounted the afternoon's humiliation. He'd never liked the way Sarah's family treated her, the subtle put-downs and constant comparisons that had shaped her self-worth since childhood. He'd watched his wife pour her heart into planning this shower, seen how excited she'd been to contribute something special, and now he was watching her fall apart because her generosity had been thrown back in her face. For the next week, Sarah heard nothing from Jessica or their mother. No apology. No acknowledgement of how cruel they'd been. No recognition that maybe they'd misjudged her intentions. The silence was deafening, confirming Sarah's worst fears about her place in the family hierarchy. She was disposable, her feelings unimportant, her efforts meaningless when weighed against Jessica's comfort and preferences. Then came the text message that changed everything. Not only was Sarah being excluded from planning the shower she'd worked so hard on, but she was being disinvited entirely. The message was brutal in its brevity, offering no explanation or apology, just a cold dismissal that made it clear Sarah was no longer welcome at her own sister's celebration. Sarah stared at that message until her eyes burned, trying to process the magnitude of this betrayal. This wasn't just about a party anymore. This was about being erased from one of the most important moments in her sister's life, being deemed so toxic and unwelcome that her presence would somehow ruin the celebration. She thought about all the hours she'd spent planning, all the money she'd invested, all the love she'd poured into making this day perfect for Jessica. None of it mattered now. The worst part was the ripple effect she knew this would create. Everyone who'd been invited to the shower would eventually learn that Sarah had been banned, and they'd all wonder why. The family narrative would paint her as the problematic sister who'd somehow deserved this treatment, and she'd have no opportunity to defend herself or tell her side of the story. She'd become the cautionary tale, the family member who'd been cut out for reasons that would be whispered about but never fully explained. Michael found her sitting on their bedroom floor at midnight, still holding her phone and staring at Jessica's message. His heart broke seeing his wife so completely devastated, reduced to a shadow of herself by people who claimed to love her. He sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms, feeling her body shake with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just this moment. "I don't understand what I did wrong," Sarah whispered against his chest. "I tried so hard to be helpful. I just wanted to make it special for her. I just wanted to be part of it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Michael felt his own eyes fill with tears at the raw pain in her voice. That's when he made a decision that would change everything. Michael had been watching his wife's family treat her like an afterthought for the entire 5 years of their marriage, and he was done staying silent. He was done watching the woman he loved be diminished by people who should have been lifting her up. He was done pretending that their cruelty was somehow normal or acceptable family dynamics. What Michael planned next would not only vindicate his wife, but would expose the true character of the people who'd hurt her. The gift he was preparing wouldn't just silence Jessica's baby shower guests, it would reveal the depth of Sarah's goodness and the shallowness of their judgment. But Sarah had no idea what her husband was planning, no concept of how dramatically her story was about to change. As she fell asleep that night, exhausted from crying and heartbroken beyond words, Sarah believed she'd lost her family forever. She believed that Jessica's rejection was final, that her mother's disappointment was justified, and that she'd somehow failed at being the sister and daughter she'd always tried so hard to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had no way of knowing that sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for the most beautiful vindications. The baby shower was still 5 days away, and Michael's plan was already in motion. What happened next would prove that love doesn't always come from the people you share blood with, and that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with words, but with actions that speak louder than any apology ever could. Saturday morning arrived like a funeral march for Sarah. She woke up knowing that in just 4 hours, her sister's baby shower would begin without her, and everyone she'd grown up with would be there celebrating while she sat at home nursing her wounds. The decorations she'd carefully chosen were probably being hung by someone else's hands, the menu she'd researched was being served to guests who might not even know she'd been banned, and her absence would likely be explained away with some fabricated excuse that painted her as the villain. Michael had been unusually quiet all week, spending long hours on mysterious phone calls and disappearing for errands he wouldn't explain. Sarah assumed he was just trying to distract himself from her family drama, maybe picking up extra work projects to avoid dealing with the awkwardness of the situation. She was grateful for the space, honestly, because watching him witness her humiliation felt almost as painful as the rejection itself. As Sarah sat in her kitchen that morning, mindlessly stirring coffee she didn't want to drink, she tried to imagine what was happening at Jessica's house. The guests would be arriving soon, carrying beautifully wrapped presents and excited smiles, ready to celebrate new life and new beginnings. Patricia would be playing the role of proud grandmother, probably wearing the expensive dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Melissa would be taking photos and posting them on social media with captions about friendship and family bonds. And Jessica would be glowing in the center of it all, surrounded by love and attention, with no visible gap where Sarah should have been standing. The doorbell rang at exactly 11:30, startling Sarah from her spiral of self-pity. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief, foolish moment, her heart leaped with the hope that maybe Jessica had come to apologize, that maybe her sister had realized the cruelty of excluding her and wanted to make things right. But when she opened the door, she found something even more unexpected. Standing on her front porch was a woman she'd never seen before, professionally dressed with a warm smile, and carrying what appeared to be official documents. Behind her was a news van with a local television station's logo emblazoned on the side, and a small crew was setting up equipment on Sarah's lawn. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca Chen, a reporter from Channel 7 News, and asked if she could have a few minutes of Sarah's time. Sarah's first instinct was to slam the door and hide, convinced that somehow the story of her family drama had become public, and she was about to be humiliated on an even larger stage. But Rebecca's demeanor was gentle, almost reverent, as she explained that she wasn't there about any controversy or scandal. She was there because of a letter she'd received, a letter that had moved her entire newsroom to tears and prompted them to do something they'd never done before. The letter had been written by Michael, and as Rebecca began to read excerpts aloud, Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. Michael had written to the news station about his wife's situation, but not to complain about her family's treatment or to seek sympathy for their cruelty. Instead, he'd written about Sarah's character, about the woman she was when no one was watching, about the kindness she showed to strangers and the generosity she exhibited, even when she had little to give. He'd told them about how Sarah volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, spending her free time walking dogs that had been abandoned and comforting cats that had been surrendered by families who no longer wanted them. He'd described how she'd organized a coat drive at her office every winter, collecting warm clothing for homeless individuals and personally delivering the donations to shelters around the city. He'd written about the elderly neighbor Sarah checked on daily, bringing groceries and medicine to a woman who had no family nearby and limited mobility. Michael had documented Sarah's quiet acts of service that she'd never mentioned to anyone, not even him sometimes. He'd written about finding her crying over news stories about children in foster care, and then discovering weeks later that she'd started a monthly donation to support programs for displaced kids. He described her staying late after work to mentor young employees who reminded her of herself at that age, struggling and insecure but trying their best to succeed. But the most powerful part of Michael's letter was his description of Sarah's relationship with children. He'd written about how neighborhood kids gravitated toward her during block parties, how she'd spend hours playing games with them while other adults socialized among themselves. He'd described her face when she held other people's babies, the pure joy and love that radiated from her despite her own struggles with infertility. He'd painted a picture of a woman whose capacity for love was so vast that being denied the chance to celebrate her sister's pregnancy had left her questioning her own worth. Rebecca explained that Michael's letter had included a request that seemed impossible at first glance. He'd asked the news station to help him give Sarah something she'd never had: recognition for the woman she truly was. He'd proposed creating a surprise baby shower for Sarah, not to celebrate a pregnancy she didn't have, but to celebrate the maternal heart she'd always possessed and the countless ways she'd nurtured others throughout her life. The idea had seemed unconventional, even strange, until Michael had provided a list of people whose lives Sarah had touched. Foster children she'd mentored, elderly residents at nursing homes where she'd volunteered, co-workers she'd supported through difficult times, and dozens of others who could testify to her kindness. When Rebecca's team had reached out to these individuals, the response had been overwhelming. Everyone wanted to participate in honoring Sarah, and many were shocked to learn that her own family had treated her so poorly. As Rebecca continued explaining the plan, Sarah felt like she was listening to someone else's life story. She'd never thought of her small acts of kindness as particularly noteworthy, certainly not newsworthy. She'd helped others because it felt natural, because seeing people struggle reminded her of her own pain and she wanted to ease their burdens if she could. The idea that Michael had been documenting these moments, that he'd seen value in actions she considered ordinary, was almost too much to process. The timing of this surprise, Rebecca explained, was not coincidental. Michael had specifically requested that Sarah's celebration happen at the exact same time as Jessica's baby shower, creating a counter-narrative that would demonstrate the difference between celebrating someone who hoarded love and someone who gave it freely. While Jessica was surrounded by people obligated to attend by family ties and social expectations, Sarah would be surrounded by people who'd chosen to be there because of how she'd impacted their lives. Sarah's first reaction was to refuse. The whole thing felt too public, too dramatic, too much like the kind of attention-seeking behavior her family had accused her of. She didn't want to prove them right by creating a spectacle, and she certainly didn't want to give them ammunition to claim she was trying to upstage Jessica's special day. But Rebecca gently pointed out that Sarah's immediate concern for her sister's feelings, even after being treated so cruelly, was exactly why so many people wanted to honor her. Michael appeared in the doorway at that moment, having returned from what Sarah now realized had been last-minute preparations for this surprise. His eyes were bright with nervous excitement and something deeper, something that looked like fierce pride and protective love. He'd spent the entire week coordinating with Rebecca's team, reaching out to people from every corner of Sarah's life, and planning an event that would showcase his wife's true character to anyone who cared to see it. The logistics had been complex but beautiful in their execution. Michael had rented the community center where Sarah volunteered, the same space where she'd organized countless charity events and fundraisers for causes she believed in. He'd contacted the local bakery where Sarah always stopped to buy day-old pastries for the homeless shelter, and they donated a cake decorated with symbols representing all the different ways she'd served others. The animal shelter had arranged for some of their gentlest therapy dogs to attend, knowing how much comfort Sarah found in their presence. But the most moving element of Michael's plan was the guest list. Instead of family members who'd taken Sarah for granted, the celebration would include people whose lives had been genuinely changed by her presence. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly neighbor Sarah visited daily, had insisted on attending despite her mobility issues because she wanted to publicly thank the young woman who'd become like a daughter to her. 3 former foster children, now adults, had traveled from different states to attend because Sarah's mentorship had helped them believe in their own potential. The local animal shelter director was coming to present Sarah with a volunteer appreciation award she'd never received because she'd always deflected recognition toward other volunteers. The children's hospital where Sarah had donated hundreds of hours reading to young patients had prepared a video montage of kids thanking her for bringing joy to their difficult days. Even Sarah's former co-workers from various jobs over the years had been contacted, and many were eager to attend and share stories about her kindness and reliability. As the reality of what Michael had orchestrated began to sink in, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her. Gratitude for her husband's thoughtfulness and love, certainly, but also a deep sadness that it had taken this elaborate demonstration to help her see her own worth. She'd spent so many years measuring herself against Jessica's achievements, focusing on what she lacked rather than what she offered, that she'd become blind to the impact of her own actions. Rebecca explained that while the celebration was happening, her news team would also be documenting the event for a special segment about unsung heroes in the community. Sarah's story would be presented not as a victim narrative, but as an inspiration about the power of quiet kindness and the way ordinary people can make extraordinary differences in others' lives. The focus would be on celebrating Sarah's character rather than condemning her family's behavior, though the contrast would be clear to anyone paying attention. As guests began arriving at the community center, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the love and recognition she'd never experienced before. People she'd helped over the years embraced her with genuine affection, sharing stories about how her kindness had impacted their lives in ways she'd never realized. Mrs. Rodriguez wept as she told everyone how Sarah's daily visits had saved her from complete isolation after her husband's death. The former foster children spoke about how Sarah's belief in them had helped them pursue education and career goals they'd thought were impossible. The animal shelter director presented Sarah with a plaque recognizing her as their Volunteer of the Year for 3 consecutive years, an honor she'd never known she'd earned because she'd always insisted that other volunteers deserved recognition more than she did. The children from the hospital appeared via video call, their faces lighting up as they saw Sarah and called out her name with excitement. Even the bakery owner spoke about how Sarah's weekly purchases of day-old goods for the homeless had inspired him to start a formal program donating unsold items to local shelters. As Sarah moved through the celebration, receiving love and recognition from dozens of people whose lives she'd touched, she began to understand what Michael had been trying to show her. Her value didn't depend on Jessica's approval or her mother's praise. Her worth wasn't diminished by her struggles with infertility or her family's rejection. She was already making a profound difference in the world, already nurturing and caring for others in meaningful ways, already embodying the maternal instincts her family had dismissed as inadequate. Meanwhile, across town at Jessica's baby shower, something entirely different was unfolding. Word had begun to spread among the guests about Sarah's celebration, and several attendees were quietly checking social media to see the news coverage of the event honoring the sister who'd been banned from their gathering. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. Jessica's shower featured expensive decorations and elaborate games focused on material gifts, while Sarah's celebration showcased genuine relationships and heartfelt testimonials about character and service. Some of Jessica's guests began to feel uneasy about participating in an event that had specifically excluded someone who was clearly beloved by so many people in their community. The conversations at Jessica's shower grew strained as people became aware of the narrative taking shape online, where local residents were praising Sarah's kindness while questioning the family dynamics that had led to her exclusion from such an important celebration. Patricia found herself in the awkward position of trying to explain Sarah's absence to guests who were seeing real-time coverage of her daughter's volunteer appreciation event. The explanations she'd prepared about Sarah being too emotional or too involved rang hollow when contrasted with the testimonials from foster children, elderly neighbors, and shelter animals who'd all benefited from Sarah's care. The sophisticated guests at Jessica's shower began to see the situation for what it really was: a family's rejection of their most genuinely caring member. Jessica herself became increasingly uncomfortable as the afternoon progressed, and more guests became aware of the competing narrative. The shower she'd wanted to be perfect, free from Sarah's supposedly overwhelming presence, was being overshadowed by the celebration of the sister she'd rejected. Every gift opening and game felt hollow when weighed against the authentic love and gratitude being expressed at Sarah's event just miles away. The breaking point came when Jessica's own mother-in-law, who'd been following the news coverage on her phone, quietly approached Jessica and asked why they'd excluded someone who was clearly such a positive force in their community. The question, asked with genuine confusion rather than accusation, forced Jessica to confront the ugliness of her own behavior in a way that no amount of family loyalty could excuse. By the time both events concluded, the story had taken on a life of its own on social media and local news coverage. Sarah's celebration had become a symbol of how communities can recognize and honor the quiet heroes among them, while Jessica's shower had inadvertently become an example of how family dynamics can sometimes silence the very voices that deserve to be heard most loudly. That evening, as Sarah and Michael sat in their living room surrounded by flowers, cards, and small gifts from her celebration, Sarah finally understood what her husband had been trying to teach her. Her family's rejection hadn't diminished her worth. It had simply revealed their inability to recognize value that didn't fit their narrow definitions of success and achievement. The phone rang repeatedly that night with calls from guests at Jessica's shower, many of whom wanted to apologize for not speaking up when Sarah was excluded, and to express their admiration for what they'd learned about her character. Several family friends admitted they'd never really known Sarah because Jessica and Patricia had always dominated conversations and social gatherings, preventing others from seeing who Sarah truly was beneath her quiet exterior. Even more meaningful were the calls from people Sarah had helped over the years, individuals who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to add their own testimonials to the growing chorus of appreciation for her kindness. The celebration Michael had planned had created a ripple effect that was still expanding, showing Sarah that her impact on the world was far greater than she'd ever imagined. 3 days later, Sarah received a text message from Jessica. Unlike the cruel dismissal that had started this entire journey, this message was long, rambling, and filled with something that looked like genuine remorse. Jessica admitted that watching the coverage of Sarah's celebration had forced her to confront her own jealousy and insecurity, emotions she'd projected onto Sarah rather than addressing within herself. The apology was imperfect and came too late to undo the damage, but it was a beginning. Jessica acknowledged that she'd felt threatened by Sarah's capacity for love and service, qualities that made Jessica question her own character and priorities. She admitted that excluding Sarah from the shower had been motivated by fear rather than any genuine problem with Sarah's behavior. Fear that Sarah's natural warmth would overshadow Jessica's own attempts to be the center of attention. Sarah read the message with mixed emotions. The validation felt good, certainly, but she no longer needed her sister's approval to know her own worth. Michael's elaborate demonstration had shown her that love and recognition were available from dozens of sources beyond her immediate family, and that her value didn't depend on the opinions of people who'd never bothered to truly see her. The story could have ended with reconciliation and family healing, but Sarah chose something more powerful. She chose to focus on the relationships that celebrated her, rather than trying to fix the ones that had diminished her. She continued her volunteer work with renewed confidence, started a mentorship program for young women struggling with family rejection, and became an advocate for recognizing the quiet heroes in every community. Michael's gift hadn't just silenced Jessica's baby shower guests. It had given Sarah her voice back. She'd learned that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from changing other people's opinions, but from recognizing that their opinions were never the measure of her worth in the first place. The celebration had ended, but the love it revealed would continue shaping Sarah's understanding of herself for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.